Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the second episode of this Sapience Thought video series where we're discussing nihilism, consumerism, and the Islamic antidote to the problems that come about because of these two ideologies. Now, in this episode, I want to go into the history and the origins of nihilism and why, and really discuss and understand why it's so rampant today. And for this, we need to go back and look at European history, especially over the past 1,000 or so years. Now, we have to remember that Europe was led by Christianity, and the Christian church dominated almost every sphere of human experience and life, whether it was education, economic, social, whichever way you look at it, the Christian church dominated. And in the 14th century, we know we had the period of Renaissance. The Renaissance took place, and this was a time where the Europeans rediscovered the classical tradition, rediscovered the Greek civilization and the works that they produced and their way of living and so on and so forth, and they were mesmerized. And by the way, all of this information, or a lot of this information and knowledge, came through the Muslims because they had preserved the works of the Greeks and done more work on top of the work that they had done. But nevertheless, this was a time when the Europeans started to rediscover the classical tradition, and they were really inspired by this. They wanted to go back to those times. And obviously, because the church, the Christian church, dominated Europe at the time, there was a lot of struggle. There was a lot of back and forth. Now I want to refer to this as two camps. You had the Christian church, and you had what we can call now as the free thinkers, the people that wanted to discover new things, inspired by the Greeks, wanted to, study the physical world, do the science, study medicine, and do all of these amazing things. Now, there was a struggle that began in around the 14th century, and this continued on. And during this time, we saw there were certain Christian theologians who tried to bridge the gap between religion and rationality. Other Christian theologians who completely rejected rationality. For example, Martin Luther, a Protestant reformer, he referred to reason, and these are his words, he referred to reason as a whore, the greatest enemy that faith has. And we can see that a lot of Christians, the majority of Christians, were against the free thinkers, as we're referring to them now, those that wanted to explore and discover new things. But this battle continued over the centuries. And then in the 16th century, we had the scientific revolution, which eventually, this and many other things, led to the period of enlightenment in the 18th century. Now, the period of enlightenment is a very interesting time in history, because this was, you can say, the time where the tables fully turned in the favor of the free thinkers. The thinkers of the Enlightenment wanted people to have a new vision, a new purpose. They wanted people to break free from the dogmas of the church. They wanted people to discover the world, to discover new things, to progress. Now, I want us to keep some context in mind here. There's something important that we need to keep in mind, which is that the European people are coming from a background of what they would see as oppression, intellectual oppression to be more specific. And now they finally have freed themselves of these shackles, and they want to discover the world and learn about the world. So you can understand the psychology here, that these people would naturally have an aversion towards religion because of what they know about religion, the experiences with the Christians. And they would now want to free themselves completely of this. However, what's very interesting is that the Enlightenment thinkers didn't become atheists immediately. Or the type, when I mean atheists, I mean, the type of new atheists that we are aware of today, such as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. They didn't completely reject everything. And this is why some of the academics, when, if asked, were the Enlightenment thinkers atheists, as in the new atheists that we know today, they would say no. If you would go to them and ask them whether they believed in God, they would acknowledge, most of the thinkers and philosophers of the Enlightenment period would acknowledge that God exists. However, they would be what you would call they were following what was referred to as a natural theology. So they would believe in God, that there was a cause, a creator behind nature and the physical world. However, they wouldn't ascribe it to or lean towards Christianity or religion as it was understood at the time. However, this did lay the foundations, or the fertile ground for the advent of new atheism and so on and so forth. But again, something we'll discuss as we go along. So the key thing I want us to pick up here, guys, is that the Enlightenment period allowed human beings to now express themselves and their intellects and engage their rational faculties in studying the world, in understanding the world, in developing the physical world. Because one of the ideas that was proposed by the Enlightenment thinkers was of progress, material progress. What they wanted human beings to do was to have a new vision, which was to create a worldly utopia, essentially paradise on earth. Now it's a very interesting concept, because prior to this, the idea was that we were to attain paradise in the hereafter, that we were living in this world, a world of pain and suffering and hardships and trials, and we had to live in this world and get through this life, but ultimately there was paradise, the eternal world. And that's what people were aspiring towards. However, the Enlightenment flipped the script, if you like, and took paradise from the hereafter and brought paradise to the here and now. So what the idea was that we as human beings, our new purpose now is to progress in the world, create a worldly paradise, and that's what our focus and vision is. Professor Leo Damrosch, in a course on the Enlightenment, he stated that one of the focuses of the Enlightenment was to turn away from the vertical plane and then to focus on the horizontal plane. Again, summarizing what I'm just saying, which is that it was taking people away from focusing on the hereafter and the spiritual reality of the world and focusing on the material reality of the world, the physical reality, the plane of here and now. This was a very important shift in psychology and thinking that took place at the time of the Enlightenment. Now, considering this and understanding this, we can start to appreciate why God and the idea of religion was not conducive to the objectives of the Enlightenment. Because if people were thinking about a hereafter, another life to come, an eternal life of bliss and peace and tranquility, well, they wouldn't fully be focusing on the here and now. And they therefore won't have the motivation to do what had to be done to attain a worldly paradise. So going back to this idea of progress and creating paradise on earth, this entailed economic growth, exponential economic growth. And Professor Karen Higgs, in her book Collision Course, she highlights that the lead up to this economic growth took place in 3 stages essentially. The first stage lasted about 500 or 600 years, where the Europeans colonized other places around the world. And this brought in a lot of money to Europe. And the second stage which lasted about 250 years, which she refers to as the stage of coal-based industry. And this allowed for the Industrial Revolution to really take off. The third stage is that she refers to as the oil-based growth, which has been taking place over the past 130 years or so. And all of this has brought in a lot of money into Europe, which allowed for the consumerist system to really take off. And it's very interesting because the more people consume, the more businesses grow. The more businesses grow, the more employment increases, the more people go into employment, into these factories which produce more goods for the consumers, and the consumers keep consuming more, and this leads to the growth of the GDP of the country, which is essentially a marker for economic growth. So at the end of the day, and the reason I'm sharing this, what's very important to understand here is that economy, money, is the key driving force here. It's not individual well-being, right? Although that was the idea proposed, what we were told is creating a worldly paradise is going to lead to happiness for human beings essentially, but that's not what's happened. And we're going to explore this much further in a lot more detail. And it's important to also realize that many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment period and the centuries that followed took offense almost to religion and the idea of religion, because it was a hindrance to the growth of economy. Marx, for example, referred to religion as the opium of the people. Now, there's many ways to understand this particular statement, but one of the ways to understand this, and one of the things we could take from this, is that he realized and understood that religion created a psychology which, from an economic standpoint, created tame human beings. Meaning that the human that was religious and believed in God and believed in the hereafter, if they weren't doing too well economically, socially, they were fine with it, because they understood this wasn't the only world. The real world was to come. paradise was to come. And this made people comfortable in their situations, even if they had less. But this wasn't good from an economic perspective, because it didn't give that human motivation now to change their condition. So this was a problem. So this was a sort of a brief history on the origins of nihilism in particular, but by extension consumerism as well. And what we're going to do in the next video, guys, is we're going to move on to looking at the direct relationship between this modernism now and nihilism, this turning away from God and nihilism. So before you guys click on the next video and watch it, if it's up already, I want to know your thoughts in the comments section below. I want to get your thoughts on how or what you think the link is between turning away from God and nihilism. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Until next time, take care. Assalamu alaikum.